My name is Linda Carty, and I'm here in the state of Texas on death row.
Due to her inability to handle frustrating episodes in her life, in 2007, Melissa Lucio abused and brutally murdered Mariah Alvarez, taking her to the abyss of no return. Here are some of the most dangerous women on death row. Antoinette Frank. March 4th, 1995. In a shocking betrayal of trust and a terrible descent into violence, Antoinette Frank, once a shy but vibrant police officer, together with an accomplice, murdered multiple victims in a robbery gone wrong. But unfortunately for her, this act of rage changed the course of her life for the worst. Born on April 30th, 1971 in New Orleans, Louisiana, Frank's life took a dark turn that would culminate in one of the most notorious crimes in the city's history. She initially pursued a career in law enforcement, joining New Orleans Police Department (NOPD) in the late 1980s. However, her time as a cop was marred by allegations of misconduct and corruption. But despite these early red flags, she still remained on the force. But not for long. And here's the thing, the bad influence that took Frank down the drain came from her sexual relationship with a drug dealer named Rogers Lakazi, a relationship jeopardizing her career as she constantly accompanied him during unlawful activities, including a violent incident where she intervened on Lakazi's behalf. 1994, Frank's life took another sinister turn as she conspired with Rogers Lakazi, her lover, the man with a criminal record, to rob the Kim An restaurant, where she had previously worked as a security guard. On the night of March 4th, 1995, Frank, along with Lakazi, entered the restaurant with the intention of robbing it. However, their plans quickly escalated into a brutal and senseless act of violence. During the robbery, the two mercilessly shot and killed 3 people: the restaurant's owner, Hang Cindy Yen, her son, Quang Vu, and Officer Ronald A. Williams II, who was off-duty but working a security detail at the restaurant as a second form of income. Cold-blooded nature of these killings sent shockwaves through the NOPD and the entire city at large. Following the murders, an intense investigation led to the arrest and subsequent conviction of Frank and Lakazi. In 1995, they were both found guilty of many charges, including first-degree murder. Frank was sentenced to death, while Lakazi, who was initially sentenced to death, was later resentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Various appeals for clemency have been made, but all have been in futility. Even her most recent appeal for clemency on October 13, 2023 was rejected during a meeting of Louisiana's Pardon Board. Now, Frank is currently held at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, Louisiana, waiting for a scheduled date for her execution. The only woman on the state's death row. Tiffany Moss.
We watched Tiffany Moss as the judge read the guilty verdicts. Tiffany Moss looked down a few times but showed absolutely no emotion.
2013 was when Tiffany caught the attention of the public due to her involvement in one of the most horrifying cases of child abuse and murder in recent memory, an act creating the pathway that led her life down the drain. Born in July 1983 in a really troubled family environment, Tiffany's life was fraught with challenges from an early age, making it really difficult for her to shape her future. In 2009, she married Eamon Moss, and together they would have 2 children. However, the family life was far from stable, stained with financial struggles and allegation of neglect. The turning point came in 2010, when Eamon gained custody of his daughter Imani from her biological mother, who was addicted to drugs. From then on, Imani's life took a tragic and harrowing turn. Despite repeated signs of abuse and neglect, including reports from school officials and concerned relatives, the authorities failed to intervene effectively. In 2013, Imani Moss's life came to a tragic end. Tiffany and Iman subjected her to unimaginable cruelty, depriving her of food and torturing her through physical and emotional abuse. Imani's emaciated and partially burnt body was discovered in a trash can outside the family's apartment, sparking widespread outrage and horror. The role Tiffany played in her stepdaughter's death was pretty shocking. During the trial, she opted to represent herself, a decision that baffled many observers given the seriousness of the charges against her. But throughout the proceedings, she would show little to no remorse or even emotion, further adding to the public's disgust. In April 2019, Moss was found guilty of multiple charges, including 1 count of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of cruelty to children, and 1 count of concealing a death. During her sentencing, she declined to present any mitigating evidence or even arguments in her defense, effectively sealing her fate. In this disturbing twist, she even attempted to waive her right to appeal, knowing that her life was doomed. May 1st, 2019, Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death by lethal injection, being the first person to be sentenced to death in Georgia in over 5 years. She initially was to be executed between June 7th and 14th, 2019, but the execution didn't occur during that time due to the appeals process, which resulted in an automatic stay of execution, a delay in carrying out a court order, being applied to the initial scheduled execution date. She's currently held at Arendelle State Prison and is Georgia's only female death row inmate. If Tiffany Moss is eventually executed, she will be the 3rd woman in Georgia to be executed since 1945. Linda Carty.
Do I want to die for something that I didn't do? And that's my fear. It's not dying, it's why I have to die.
In 2001, greed and a lack of contentment took hold of Linda Carty as she committed one of the most gruesome crimes ever. This crime made her infamous on the international stage, causing a bit of ruckus because of her identity. Born October 5, 1958, in St. Kitts to Anguillan parents, Carty holds British citizenship as St. Kitts was a British colony at the time of her birth. In 1982, she relocated to the U.S., settling in Houston, Texas. However, her life took this dramatic turn in May 2001, when she became embroiled in this shocking crime. On May 16, 2001, Carty and 3 co-defendants invaded a home and kidnapped a 20-year-old female, Joanna Rodriguez, and her newborn son. Joanna would die from suffocation while the baby was found unharmed. The prosecution alleged that Carty, who had recently suffered a miscarriage, planned to pass off Rodriguez's baby as her own. Now, the case was built with circumstantial evidence and testimony from accomplices who struck deals with prosecutors in exchange for lighter sentences. In February 2002, unfortunately for her, Carty was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. However, her trial was marred by allegations of ineffective legal representation and withheld evidence, prompting appeals and international outcry. Even human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, rallied behind Carty, arguing that she did not receive a fair trial. One of the key points of contention was the failure to disclose crucial evidence that could have potentially exonerated Carty. This included information about an alternate suspect and inconsistencies in witness testimonies. Additionally, concerns were raised about the quality of her legal defense, with her attorneys being accused of gross incompetence. So over the years, Carty's case became a focal point in the debate over the death penalty and the flaws in the U.S. criminal justice system. Advocates would point to her British citizenship and the lack of consular assistance she received during her arrest and trial as further grounds for concern. Even the British government weren't left out as they intervened on her behalf by filing an amicus curiae brief, appealing to the U.S. authorities to review her case. Her case did receive attention in September 2009 when her image was placed on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square by her British supporters. Now, despite numerous appeals and legal challenges, Carty remains on death row in Texas. She's presently at the Mountain View unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where she will be until either a solution comes forth or a date is set for her possible execution. Angelina Rodriguez. In a bid for financial gain, Angelina planned and perfected a hideous murder. Unfortunately for her, the murder opened up a can of worms and eventually came back to haunt her. Born May 31, 1968, in Montebello, California, Angelina once worked as a laborer before she met her husband Frank, a special education teacher, while they were employed at a camp in San Luis Obispo, California. The couple wedded in April 2000, marking her 4th marriage. Prosecutors alleged that shortly after tying the knot, Rodriguez obtained a $250,000 life insurance policy on Frank, valued at $366,000 in 2018, which was more than enough reason for her to devise a plan to end his life. She was suspected of lacing Frank's tea with oleander leaves, a dark green leaf with a glossy appearance that is extremely poisonous, loosening the gas cap on their clothes dryer, and finally adding antifreeze to her husband's Gatorade. On September 9, 2000, Frank Rodriguez unfortunately passed away. Initially, his death was deemed inconclusive, hindering Angelina's ability to acquire a death certificate or claim Frank's life insurance. But out of desperation, she advocated for further investigation, which led to tests confirming intentional poisoning, thereby warranting her arrest for the murder in Paso Robles, California, in February 2001. It wasn't until 3 years after Frank's demise that Angelina's murder trial commenced in the autumn of 2003. During the period following her arrest, prosecutors discovered suspicious details surrounding the death of her 13-month-old daughter, Alicia, back in 1993. Angelina said that Alicia choked on a pacifier, but investigators suspected that she tampered with it, removing the nipple to suffocate Alicia. At that time, Angelina subsequently sued the pacifier manufacturer and received a settlement of $700,000. Despite Alicia's death being ruled accidental, Angelina acquired a $50,000 life insurance policy, even though they never linked her to her daughter's death. The information presented during the trial suggested Angelina's financial motives for the murder. In October 2003, Angelina was found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances, murder for financial gain, and attempted witness tampering. However, she wasn't convicted of soliciting murder. On January 12, 2004, Angelina was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Now, despite her conviction and sentence, Angelina persisted in proclaiming her innocence, maintaining that her husband's death resulted from suicide by antifreeze poisoning. In 2010, Angelina was given a new sentence hearing, but her luck wouldn't change as she was resentenced to death. Her most recent appeal was denied by the Supreme Court of California in February 2014. However, Angelina remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. Melissa Lucio.
This is your chance to set it straight, because right now it looks like capital murder. Right now it looks like you're a cold-blooded killer.
Anybody can get frustrated once in a while, but not everyone can handle frustration properly. Some would go about it in a calm and sane way, while the likes of Melissa Lucio take it out on the loved ones around them, leading to detrimental consequences that they can't come back from. Born June 18, 1969, in Lubbock, Texas, Lucio grew up in this tumultuous environment marked by poverty and abuse. Her experiences with domestic violence and traumas that she had to endure throughout her life were horrific in nature. Despite those challenges, though, Lucio became a mother to 14 children, striving to provide for them even in the face of limited resources. In 2007, tragedy would strike with Lucio's little daughter, Maria Alvarez, dying under suspicious circumstances. Following her death, Lucio found herself thrusted into this nightmare as she became the primary suspect in her daughter's demise. Lucio would insist that Mariah's death was accidental, explaining that the bruises found on her body were a result of a fall she had from a flight of stairs some days earlier. Authorities would focus their attention on her, alleging that she had abused and murdered her child. So during her trial, recorded statements from Lucio's interrogation after her eventual arrest were characterized as a confession. To make matters worse for her, Dr. Norma J. Farley, a pathologist, testified that the autopsy of the child indicated that her death wasn't caused by falling down the stairs, but rather blunt force trauma. Even the emergency room physician laid his 2 cents on the case, as he said that he had never encountered a case of child abuse as severe as Mariah's. The only string of hope Lucia's defense had was the contention that Mariah's injuries resulted from a fall down the stairs, just like she said, and that her psychological state contributed to her conflicting statements made to authorities. But despite these arguments put forth by the defense, the string of hope was severed as Lucio was eventually convicted of capital murder and subsequently sentenced to death in 2008. At the time of Mariah's death, Lucio was pregnant with twins, but unfortunately for her, authorities compelled her to place them for adoption after delivering them while in jail. As of 2022, Lucio was being held on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she's to wait for either clemency or a possible date for her execution. Wendy Andriano. On October 8, 2000, greed would take Wendy Andriano down the road of betrayal and deceit, giving her the motive to commit a hideous and gruesome murder. A murder perceived by some but not expected to come, leading her to a position of no return. Born August 6, 1970, in Fortaleza, Brazil, Wendy would later move to the U.S., where she met Joseph Andriano. The two would get married in January 1994, but that was when her life turned dark. In the beginning, the relationship seemed normal, but it gradually descended into a nightmare of abuse and manipulation. The couple had 2 children together, and during which Wendy claimed that Joe subjected her to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse. She also said that she endured years of torment, feeling trapped in her marriage, unable to escape, and despite seeking help from authorities and friends, she felt helpless in breaking free from Joe's control. So in 1998, Wendy's life reached a breaking point when Joe was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and his health rapidly declined. As his condition worsened, Wendy became his primary caregiver, adding to the immense stress she was already under. It got so bad that Joe had to resort to chemotherapy, and at this point, Wendy began to resent her increased responsibilities. She began to frequent bars and have affairs. To make matters worse, she and her husband solicited a friend to pose as her husband during the life insurance pre-screening processes, even though no insurance was ever purchased. On October 8, 2000, tragedy struck as Wendy bludgeoned her 33-year-old husband Joe to death with a bar stool and stabbed him in the neck with a 13-inch knife in their Arizona apartment. She surprisingly called 911 earlier, claiming Joe was dying but turned paramedics away, citing his wish not to be resuscitated. Again, she would call 911, reporting that she had stabbed and beaten her husband to death in self-defense. But despite Wendy's earlier claims of abuse, Joe's weakened state from illness and poisoning made self-defense unlikely. And because of this, Wendy was therefore charged with murder. August 23, 2004, 4 years after the crime, Wendy's trial began. It was her attempts to obtain life insurance and a medical malpractice lawsuit that signified her reason for the murder to be financial. It was also alleged that she poisoned her husband with sodium azide, but despite Wendy's testimony of abuse and struggle, she was found guilty of first-degree murder on November 18, 2004, and sentenced to death on December 22, 2004. Wendy remains on death row, awaiting the outcome of her appeals. And as of January 2018, Andriano is one of the 3 most dangerous women on Arizona's death row. Samantha Allen. In a bid to punish a teenage girl, Aim Deal, for an offense she supposedly committed due to severe hunger, Samantha Allen, coupled with her husband, committed a devastating crime that sent shockwaves throughout the state of Arizona. Born June 14, 1988, Samantha grew up in this dysfunctional household. As a young adult, she found herself in constant tumultuous relationships, and some would even claim that she struggled with drugs. In 2011, Samantha Allen, along with her husband John Allen, were involved in this tragic incident, resulting in the death of her cousin, Aim Deal. Aim was subjected to relentless abuse and neglect, enduring extreme punishment methods, such as being forced to walk back and forth on the sidewalk barefoot in extremely hot Phoenix temperatures. Or how about being forced into a trunk as punishment for stealing ice pops? On the sweltering Arizona summer night of July 12, 2011, Aim was locked inside of a box as punishment and left there overnight. The next morning, after suffering suffocation, Aim was found dead. Now, following Aim's death, an investigation revealed a harrowing history of abuse inflicted upon her by Samantha, John, and other family members. Reports described the household as one embodied with cruelty and neglect, with Aim being singled out for particularly brutal treatment. Samantha and John were eventually arrested and charged with numerous offenses, including first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and kidnapping. Now, during their trial, evidence painted a disturbing picture of Aim's final moments and the extent of the abuse she endured. Testimony from witnesses included neighbors and other children in the household, detailing systematic and sadistic treatment suffered by Aim at the hands of Samantha and John Allen and other household members. In 2017, Samantha Allen's case went to trial, where she was portrayed as a key perpetrator in Aim's death. Prosecutors would highlight her active participation in the events leading up to Aim's death and her failure to intervene or seek help for the vulnerable child. In a highly publicized verdict, Samantha was found guilty of first-degree murder and other charges related to Ames' death. The jury's decision reflected the severity of her actions and the level of guilt assigned to her in the eyes of the law. August 7, 2017, Samantha Allen was sentenced to death by lethal injection for her role in Ames Deal's murder.
John Allen now joining his wife Samantha on death row. The first time in state history that a couple is sentenced to die.
And coupled with Wendy Andriano, she's also one of the 3 most dangerous women on Arizona's death row. Shauna Ford. Heads filled with extremism and violence led to the robbery where Shauna Ford and her accomplices murdered 2 people. However, despite not directly carrying out those murders, her position as the ringleader and the one who calls the shots brought her to the doorstep of condemnation. Born December 6, 1967, Ford would also grow up in turmoil and experiences of instability and adversity throughout her early years. She became involved in far-right extremist movements, drawn to their ideologies of anti-immigration and white supremacy. In the mid-2000s, Ford emerged as a prominent figure within the Minutemen Civil Defense Corps, MCDC, a loose coalition of individuals and groups advocating for stricter border control and immigration enforcement along the U.S.-Mexico border. However, her involvement took a dark turn as she became associated with a more radical faction, the Minutemen American Defense, MAD, within the movement. In 2009, Ford orchestrated a heinous crime that was as shocking as an electric volt passing through your spine. Alongside accomplices including Jason Eugene Bush and Albert Gaxola, Ford plotted and executed a home invasion in Arviaca, Arizona, under the guise of targeting drug traffickers and illegal immigrants. Now, the victims of this home invasion were Raul Flores Jr., a 29-year-old man, and his daughter, Brzenia Ilyana Flores. Ford and her accomplices mistakenly believed that family to be involved in illegal activities and sought to steal drugs and money from them. Armed with weapons, including firearms, they forcibly entered the Flores residence in the early hours of May 30th, 2009. A violent confrontation ensued, during which Raul was shot and killed by the intruders. Brzenia, who witnessed her father's murder, was also shot but initially survived. Despite pleading for her life, Brzenia was mercilessly shot again by Bush, making the only survivor of the attack to be Gina Gonzalez, the victim's wife and mother, who was seriously wounded as a result of the attack. Following this brutal crime, Ford and her accomplices fled the scene, but were eventually apprehended by law enforcement. They were then given multiple offenses, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and burglary. On February 14, 2011, Shauna Ford was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for her role in the home invasion and the murder of Raul and Brzenia Flores. Her accomplices were also found guilty. Bush was also sentenced to death alongside Ford, but Gaxola was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole plus 54 years. Even though Shauna still maintains her innocence regarding this gruesome crime she committed, she remains on death row at the Arizona State Prison Complex, awaiting her execution. Rosie Alfaro. Some say it's youthful exuberance. Others say it's euphoria. But no matter what it was, Rosie Alfaro, the not-so-good girl, took advantage of her friendship with the victim's family and committed a heartless murder that changed the course of her life forever. Born October 12, 1971 in California, you can imagine her life was also marked by adversity. Raised in a troubled environment, she would face challenges like poverty and abuse, significantly impacting her upbringing. In 1990, at the age of 18, Alfaro committed a heinous act that would not only change her future, but those involved as well. On June 15th, she came into the home of Autumn Wallace in the city of Anaheim, California, with the intention to rob the house. Tragically, Wallace was home alone at the time. Now, things quickly escalated as she coaxed Wallace into the bathroom on a ruse, where she mercilessly attacked Wallace by stabbing her 57 times with a kitchen knife. Autumn fought bravely but eventually succumbed to her injuries. Alfaro then raided the house and sold things for $240, money she would supposedly use to acquire drugs. Authorities swiftly apprehended Alfaro, who confessed to the crime during interrogation. Now, she said she was high on heroin and cocaine when she stabbed Wallace, even though there was no such evidence of that. When her story of what happened began having different shades and parts to it with no evidence backing her, she knew she was about to face the music for her crime. Despite that troubled background, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances, and she was eventually sentenced to death in 1992. Now, she was the first woman to be given the gas chamber, and at the time of the sentencing, was the third woman on death row in California. However, Rosie Alfaro remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, in Chowchilla, where she awaits her possible execution. Kerry Lynn Dalton. June 26, 1988. Dalton committed a horrible crime, changing her life for the worse. However, what made this story unsettling is not just the fact that she murdered, but the heinous way in which she did it. Now, born on January 24, 1959 in Van Nuys, California, we can imagine that her childhood was far from perfect, having an alcoholic father who left her and her siblings in the care of her mother. Her problematic childhood pushed her to a life of drug abuse, which she took on for years to come. Now, despite the rough terrain of her upbringing, Kerry was able to find love, get married, and eventually have 5 children. But it seemed that she was never destined to find happiness because, like her father, her husband also departed and eventually ended up in prison, leaving Kerry to care for their children by herself. It was no surprise that Kerry's use of drugs was still imminent as the pressure of taking care of her kids got to her. It was at this point that she met, befriended, and lived with 23-year-old Irene Melanie May, who also was a drug user at the time. Now, misery loves company because she found people like Mark Lee Tompkins, Cheryl Ann Baker, and another man known only by the name George. Little did she know that her friendship with these people would jeopardize her life forever. June 26, 1988, Kerry accused Irene of theft, leading to a heated argument. This loud altercation prompted neighbors to call the police. Upon arrival, the sheriff's deputy found no evidence of theft or other criminal activity, except for Joanne Fedor, the resident, being under the influence of methamphetamine. So despite searching inside and out of the house and finding no signs of violence, the deputies classified Joanne as a 5150, indicating mental incapacity. Mark, George, Cheryl, and Kerry left Joanne's home, while Irene disappeared without a trace. Irene's family carried out this extensive search with law enforcement, and it was eventually revealed through multiple witnesses that the trio had ruthlessly murdered Irene in retaliation for allegedly stealing from Kerry. Reports showed that they subjected her to electric shocks, inflicted injury to her knee, and ultimately killed her by injecting her with a syringe containing battery acid. On May 14, 1992, Kerry and her friends were arrested for torturing and murdering Irene, and she was eventually sentenced to death. Ever since her sentencing, she's been at the CCWF in Chowchilla, California, awaiting her execution and appealing her death sentence.